Today we're going to examine the history of a car that was new in the Pontiac lineup for the 1960 model year, and that was the 1960 Pontiac Ventura. So if we're talking about the 1960 Pontiac Ventura, then what in the world are we doing taking a look at this orange automobile? Well, what you're seeing here is arguably a bit of the genesis of the 1960 Ventura, because it was a response to the success of the Bonneville, which was introduced in 1957 as an upper-end high-tech trim on Star Chiefs. It came with power seats and fuel injection, underhood, and it was so successful that Pontiac ended up making the Bonneville a full line of vehicles for the 1959 model year, as opposed to just a specialty model in 1957 and 1958. Now, the Bonneville was really started by, and the name was started by, this little sporty coupe. Pontiac introduced two of these kind of concept cars in 1954, and that's where the Bonneville name came from. And then this transitioned into the 1957 Bonneville specialty model, which became the 1959 Bonneville, let's call it series of full-line cars. You get Bonnevilles in 2 doors, 4 doors, all different types of configurations. And then in 1962, Pontiac, again because of the success of the Bonneville, would introduce the Grand Prix in that particular model year. But in between 1959, when the Bonneville became its own model, and 1962, when the Grand Prix was introduced, Pontiac introduced the Ventura, a vehicle that's sometimes forgotten in the overall Pontiac lineup because it didn't last all that long. And in fact, the Ventura had a confused identity over the period of time it was produced, from 1960 to 1977. It would spend 1960 to 1970 as a full-size car before being downsized into a compact car for 1971 to 1977. But back at its inception, the Ventura really was designed to fill a void between the increasingly popular Bonneville at the top of the lineup and the Catalina at the lower end of the lineup, although the Star Chief also did exist, and that was a bit less luxurious Bonneville. It was on the longer 124-inch wheelbase, and the Catalina and Ventura would be on a 122-inch wheelbase. So if you got the big Pontiacs, the Bonneville, and the Star Chief, you got the big wheelbase, 124-inch wheelbase. And if you got the Catalina or Ventura for 1960, you got the smaller 122-inch wheelbase. All the cars were 80 inches wide, but the Ventura was really kind of designed as an upper-end, more sporty and exclusive Catalina, and based on the shorter wheelbase. It meant that bigger wasn't always better, and, well, that probably wasn't a bad philosophy for some car buyers. And interestingly, Pontiac decided to give the Ventura a relatively limited number of models in the lineup to try to make it a bit more exclusive. More specifically, it was only available in a 2- and 4-door hardtop. You couldn't get it in a convertible or with a pillared sedan, just 2- and 4-door hardtops. And, offering the Ventura in all different body styles perhaps wasn't going to be the best idea. Pontiac, I think, thought that would just dilute the overall brand. It was supposed to be an upper-end sporty vehicle, not something that you could imagine badging a 4-door sedan with. Let's now discuss the design of the 1960 Pontiacs by walking around this particular 1960 Ventura. Now, the first thing to notice as we look at this front view of a 1960 Ventura is that Pontiac's famous split grille is missing here. Yes, the split grille that adorned almost all Pontiacs from 1959 until Pontiac's demise is not apparent on the 1960 Pontiacs. And why is that? Well, recall the typical design cycle for these vehicles, and you'll realize that designers were penning the 1960 models before the 1959 models were even released, much less known to be so successful. And so you have designers really changing the entire front-end styling to what you see here, this thin blade, horizontally oriented grille, again, emphasizing the width of the overall vehicle, and that is further cemented by that very sharp crease that runs around the entire front end of the car. It doesn't run around the entire car, as we're going to see in a moment. It kind of terminates at the door before a new form starts a little bit further rearward. But you certainly get the sense of width from this front end. And that's because these cars were indeed wide. They were a full 80 inches wide, which was the widest that they could be without having oversized lights on them and a declaration that they were oversized vehicles. So you have, like I said, the thin blades, the horizontal blades that were apparent for 1960 in Pontiac, but they would go away for the 1961 model year once designers realized how popular that split grille theme was. I do think the 1960 Pontiac is rather handsome, as we'll talk about a little bit more as we walk around the rest of the vehicle. Now, as we transition to this front three-quarter view, this is a complicated vehicle from a surfacing perspective. Take a look, as I was mentioning, the front had that crease that ran around the entire front end and then kind of terminated at the door. Notice how it stops before a new form starts just after the door and continues on throughout the rest of the rear quarter panel. But if you look at this body side, there's a couple key themes here that are meshed together. First, you have this tubular convex surface that runs the entire length of the body from the headlamp nacelle all the way up front and goes to the rear of the vehicle, kind of unbroken and in relatively constant section all the way back. Then you have the lower section of the body that is denoted by a relatively sharp crease on the underside of that tubular surface, and that's relatively plain, just kind of tucks in at the rocker, except you have a very interesting wheel arch out back. You have kind of the squircle shape, but then you also have a crease that starts in front of the rear wheel and then continues on to form not only a surface on the quarter panel, but also a surface on the bumper. That's kind of a complex wheel arch there. I like how at the leading edge, it kind of gradually grows, and you can see the shadow that's created in between that wheel arch and the tubular surface that I was mentioning before. Again, a beautiful detail. Now you have another, let's say, series of surfaces. I mentioned that front portion that's kind of wraps around the hood and continues to the mid portion of the door that you see there. And then you have a similar surface that begins after the door and continues through the quarter panel. And this is so scalloped out that look at the shadow on the underside of it. You don't really see this on cars anymore, where you have surfaces that create shadows like this. But it's just beautiful, and it's amazing how designers and clay modelers really worked together back during this time frame to create surfaces that not just had creases, let's say, but actually created shadows on the car, just something that you don't see anymore. Now, another thing that you don't really see anymore on cars are these thin roofs. Of course, you've got the wraparound front glass on this 1960 Pontiac, but also look at the C-pillar and how delicate it is, how it tapers going from the top portion of the roof down to where it meets the quarter panel, kind of touches down there. Just beautifully thin and elegant. I would say this was really a response to the 1957 Chryslers that had these thin roof designs. Before that, a lot of General Motors roofs were relatively chunky, but 1959 models really patterned after the 1957 Chryslers introduced this thin look to the roofs. And that's something I miss on modern cars too, with all the rollover standards. You have these chunky A pillars, B pillars, C pillars, thick roofs. It looks like you're kind of sitting in a vault. And that's nice, obviously, for safety in many regards, but, well, you just can't see out of the car that well. This car you can see out of very, very well, and maybe that's perhaps most important when you're driving. And before we continue on to the rear of the vehicle, I just wanted to show this close-up because it really shows how that crease followed by a relatively severe fillet underneath it creates this shadow that wraps around the front end of the car. And it's a similar technique for the rear of the vehicle, except the rear crease that kind of forms the leading edge of that surface is capped by some bright work. And here there's no bright work. I actually think it makes that crease look even sharper and more distinctive. But you really get a sense for the body side sections here. Imagine trying to stamp that fender and how many ins and outs it has. I can't even imagine how many strikes that would take to stamp that. Nowadays, you're trying to stamp a fender or a vehicle part with 3 or 4 strikes. This had to take about 7 to 8. You got to imagine putting in all those creases, having it bend around to form that tubular shape, getting that really sharp crease at the upper portion. Again, this is a very expensive car to manufacture just from a sheet metal standpoint. Now let's take a look at the side view of this vehicle, and you can see all these forms working together to form a complex and yet beautiful just side profile on this car. And there's some other proportional details that you can see here. Look at how long the rear overhang is relative to the stubby front overhang. Big dash to axle on this car. Looks like the front wheels are pushed all the way out to the corner. That wasn't really the style for the rear of the vehicles. Big overhangs were in vogue during the time, and also having the rear wheel in line with that touchdown on the C-pillar was also in vogue. But you can also tell, remember I was talking about that thin roof, you really see the thin roof design here, again patterned off of the Chryslers of the era. And what's interesting about that is, remember that from a personal luxury coupe standpoint, the vehicle that was really having success in the marketplace was the Thunderbird. And the Thunderbird had anything but a thin roof. It had a very fat, chunky C-pillar. In fact, take a look at this photo for a potential Ventura proposal on the 1959 Pontiacs. And what do you notice? It's parked next to a Thunderbird. And Pontiac was potentially trying to copy that backlight as well as the C-pillar and even a little bit of the side profile in developing a Ventura. I would say even the wheel arches are pretty similar. Look at the rear wheel arch form on the Pontiac versus the Thunderbird. Of course, there's a bigger lip and a more distinctive lip on the Pontiac. But, you know, GM design chief Bill Mitchell used to say, if you're going to rob from a bank, not a grocery store. And the Thunderbird was a highly popular vehicle. The four-place Thunderbird was a highly popular vehicle during this time frame. And it's unmistakable here. Of course, these vehicles are shot together on GM's design patio, so you can see what they were trying to do. They were trying to capture a little bit of the magic that had bestowed the Thunderbird and do so with the Pontiac. Also notice that this Ventura is a short wheelbase car, the Catalina base car, but it has the Pontiac taillights and the rear end design. So they were trying to mess around with some different things to figure out how could they make a interesting yet upscale and sporty vehicle that was in the middle of the lineup in between the Bonneville and the lower end Catalina. But I do find it humorous that this was maybe one of the original proposals for the Ventura, and it is a clear copy of the Thunderbird of the time. Now let's rotate around to the rear three-quarter view, and you can see this tremendously large backlight on the vehicle that complements those toothpicky C-pillars. Just a ton of open glass in this vehicle. And also notice as we look at the deck lid, it's almost perfectly flat aside from these tubular forms that form the tail lamps. But you have, again, similar to the front, you have that form that starts just aft of the door and continues around the rear of the vehicle that's really only broken up by those tail lamp forms. And I love how flat and wide this deck lid is, just, again, accentuating the width of the vehicle. And there's a beautiful detail. Notice that underneath the deck lid, there's the plate that says Ventura with the fuel fill. And you have this very sharp crease and a scalloped out section that really comes and originates from the midpoint of the reverse lamps and then kind of touches down at the rear bumper and does so where I'll call them bumper guards. These are not really bumper guards, not functional at least, but it just looks fantastic. What a beautiful detail. Let's look at the dead-on rear view now. Here you can see that sharp crease that comes from the midsection of the reverse lamps and then touches down at the bumper right in line with the bumper guards, and how it's scalloped out creates a beautiful shadow. Lots of shadows on this car. Notice the uppermost crease that is on the deck lid throws a shadow beneath it because there's such a deeply scalloped section underneath it. Then you have the body kind of coming outboard again, except for these scallop sections creating another shadow. I mean, this car has so much visual theater. It's amazing. And I love the detail in the bumper. Those bumper guards are humorous. Like I said, they're really not guarding anything. They're just there for show. But then you have these vertical blades that are in between the two so-called bumper guards to add a little bit more dimension to, I'll call it a rather plain bumper otherwise. But notice you can see some symmetry in the form of the bumper. The upper portion of the bumper mimics the form that's in the upper portion of the vehicle, kind of this I'll call it a little bit bulbous form that has the crease running around it. So there's harmony in this design, front to rear, top to bottom, and again, just a beautiful detail. Now, interestingly, take a look at this design proposal for the rear of the 1960 Pontiacs. This was for a Bonneville, but you can see in the rear here, the designers actually had the opposite intention originally for the car, namely that the reverse lights were on top, tail lights were on bottom. I'm glad they made that change. I think they did that because they thought that they could integrate the reverse lamps and keep the deck lid, let's say, cleaner and giving it more of this flat look. And the tail lamps beneath that enabled you to do that. But I think the final design was actually better, but what do you think? Let me know. Here, by the way, is the front of that proposal for the 1960 Bonneville. You notice that the hood is a little bit different, has kind of a rocket shape coming out of it, it appears, that was more prominent in the final version. You have a little bit more doodaddery, I'll call it, in between the headlamps, and you have some kind of diagonal strakes that are behind the front wheel. But aside from that, it was pretty similar to what would end up on the final car. And we'll kind of transition to one more proposal for the 1960 Pontiacs. This has a biplane bumper with some horizontal strakes in it and looks like turbine intakes there in the bumper, in addition to the horizontal grille forms and a stand-up hood ornament, it appears. Now, in between the headlamps, you see a design that I think would end up becoming part of the 1960 Oldsmobile front end. So again, remember during this time frame that General Motors styling leaders were passing in between studios, and they would take different design cues from one car and tell designers to put it on another car. All the designers were only able to participate in their own studio, aside from upper management. So Pontiac didn't know what Oldsmobile or Buick or Cadillac was doing. The only people who knew that were the design executives. And so each design team was really designing in a vacuum for their particular brand. But the design executives would take stuff from one, put it on the other, and, they did a brilliant job. They knew what they were doing. But I thought it was interesting here that this detail was on this proposal for the 1960 Pontiac. And that bumper, by the way, like I said, is crazy. Much crazier than the relatively muted and kind of standard-looking bumper that would make it through to production. But you have those little Oldsmobile details on this front end to begin with. Now let's transition inside, because the interior of the 1960 Venturas was also a piece of art. You did get an upscale interior when you ordered your Ventura. And take a look at the bench seat here in the vinyl that has, three colors in it. Very handsome-looking interior. The bench seats in GM cars I find to be relatively comfortable from this time period. Not too bad, but of course, the seat comfort would get increasingly good as the 1960s would go on into the 1970s. But here's certainly a great-looking interior. You can see that thin roof and how much glass there is with the backlight and the rear quarter window and the very thin C-pillar. Notice also on the roof that this has, I believe, the swivel spotlight reading light that you can move around if you wanted to get some light in a particular area. Also, take a look at how big the cutout is there for the door underneath the windshield. That is an area that's pretty rust-prone, I would say, on these vehicles. But one of the things that you can notice as well is the bench seat here is really low to the ground. And these vehicles have really a legs-out position from a seating standpoint. It's not uncomfortable. In fact, I think it's quite comfortable. But it's more of a sports car seating position. And GM would rectify this when they would redo their full-size cars for 1961. They would move the seating position up. Some of the designers felt, after actually sitting in these vehicles, that they went a little too far. The whole goal of the design for the 1959s and 1960s was to make them lower, longer, wider, and lower meant that was pushing the overall roof line down, which meant that where you sat, that location also had to come down. And some felt that the designers had gone too far in this particular generation. But one place where designers definitely didn't go too far was the beauty of the instrument panel. Look at that IP and how it just is so organic and flowing. Kind of flows into the doors a little bit, but it's still flat. That IP flowing into the doors would become more of a theme a little bit later. But look at the steering wheel even, with that lucite portion up top that would just glimmer in the sunlight, the relatively large hub with the two-spoke wheel and the horn ring. And all the fine metallic details here. The ashtray, by the way, is behind the P in Pontiac on the right side of the IP. That's why it doesn't quite perfectly align with the other letters. The Pontiac, if you will, forms the portion of the glove box door. But just a beautiful, beautiful interior overall. You certainly thought that you got a great value when you procured a 1960 Pontiac. Now, under hood in your Pontiac, you got your choice of 389 cubic inch V8s, and they differed generally by whether or not you opted for the optional 4-speed Hydromatic. This was before the Turbo Hydromatic, or you went with the manual transmission. But this was an automatic, and so the standard engine in the Catalina, Ventura, and Star Chief was a 283 horsepower, 389 cubic inch, two-barrel engine, with a 10.25 to 1 compression ratio, making 283 horsepower. Optional in these, but standard on the Bonneville, was a 303 horsepower 4-barrel high compression 389 with a 10.25 to 1 compression ratio. And then the top engine was a tri-power 2-barrel 389 cubic inch V8 that made 318 horsepower. That was optional on all models. Now, if you got a manual transmission behind your 389, the top engine remained that 318 horsepower 3.2 barrel, but the other engines had lower compression. More specifically, the Catalina, Ventura, and Star Chief came standard with a 8.6 to 1 compression ratio, 389 cubic inch V8, when you got a manual transmission, and those engines made 215 horsepower. Then in the Bonneville, you got a standard 281 horsepower 4-barrel 389 that had the same 8.6 to 1 compression ratio. So it's kind of interesting that Pontiac really differentiated. This was clearly not the performance era. If you got a manual transmission, it was thought that you were getting it because of economy, not because of performance. Of course, that would change in the intervening years, where the manual transmission cars would get similar, if some cases even a little bit more horsepower. But here in this day and age, the manual transmission kind of signified that you wanted economy, and that 215 horsepower economy 2-barrel could be optioned in any of the Pontiacs. So you could get it in a different Pontiac, but it was only standard with the manual transmission cars. In any case, the 1960 Pontiac Ventura is just a gorgeous car. I hope that you enjoyed this walk around and some of the history. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.